Hey everyone, Brandon Snyder here. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me and welcome to a new series called Heavy Metal Masterpieces. So the genre itself is generally considered to have been created by the band Black Sabbath, and most especially Tony Iommi's guitar parts, in that the band itself formed in '68 but released their debut in 1970. And from that, the genre itself has reinvented itself multiple times over the last 53 years, starting with the more traditional heavy metal sound that is like Black Sabbath, and then moving into the new wave of British heavy metal and power metal, thrash metal, speed metal, death metal, new metal, and it just keeps going to this day, reinventing itself. And so this series here, I wanted to focus on the more popular, the bigger albums that define the heavy metal genre, and then save the more obscure titles for a future series that I'm going to be doing. But for this one here, Heavy Metal Masterpieces, we're going to dive into it here in just a bit. But before we get started, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things help support my channel. I would greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, by subscribing, you'll be able to stay up to date on some really cool episodes and series just like this with heavy metal masterpieces. So I'm going to be going by year of release and then sort of alphabetical at that point if we got multiples from a particular year. So this isn't really a countdown. I'm not saying these are the only heavy metal masterpieces. These are just some of them for this first episode, and of course there's going to be many more to come and so forth. But kicking this off, we've got Dio Holy Diver from 1983, the debut studio album from the band, and namesake Ronnie James Dio, who comes from Rainbow and Black Sabbath, two other very classic metal bands. Running out the lineup, we got Jimmy Bain on bass, also coming from Rainbow, Vinny Appice on drums, coming from Black Sabbath, and Vivian Campbell on guitar, who would go on to play with Whitesnake and Def Leppard. So even at the time, it was a who's who in the band, but with Vivian Campbell joining as an unknown at that time, and later on, it basically is a super group. The album would go on to sell 2 million copies just in the US alone due to songs like the title track, Holy Diver, but also Rainbow in the Dark, one of the most defining songs of the era. Stand Up and Shout, Don't Talk to Strangers, all of those being really great tracks off of here. But for me, the album is really good from start to finish, just as a whole. It flows from strength to strength on here. Even the songs in between the hits are really good on here. Just, it's in one of those non-stop kind of albums all the way through. And then when they did a remix last year in 2022, I didn't think it was possible to make this album better, but they actually did, at least in my opinion, proving that this album here is a heavy metal masterpiece. All right, next one up. Iron Maiden, Peace of Mind from 1983. Didn't realize when doing this how many 1983 classic albums there were, and these are just two of them here. But Peace of Mind, fourth studio album from Iron Maiden. It was the second one to feature new vocalist Bruce Dickinson, but first one to feature new drummer Nico McBrain, and therefore completing their classic lineup. And so while most people would actually select their third studio album, Number of the Beast, that one for me is just never really quite clicked all the way through. Whereas this one here, I think the band found their footing, who they are, that sort of stuff. And it's got the right production on it. It's just got quality of songs to match. And it's consistent throughout, all kinds of key things, for me at least, that make these heavy metal masterpieces. And then you got the iconic songs like Where Eagles Dare, Revelations, Flight of Icarus, and the absolute classic The Trooper is on here. But the album itself is just so solid from start to finish on here. That's what makes it a heavy metal masterpiece, in my opinion. Okay, next one up is another one from 1983. Quiet Riot, Metal Health, third studio album. Yes, actually the third. If you don't know, they had released 2 albums in Japan prior to this that have, to this date, really been unreleased in the US, although bootlegs and various small labels have tried to get copies of it out there and stuff. But This was the first US release for the band. It became the first metal album to reach #1 on the Billboard 200 album chart. Pretty cool thing. It would go on to sell 6 million copies. So even though today the name Quiet Riot doesn't really, revel in that same sort of stature as bands like Iron Maiden that we just mentioned, and Dio and stuff of that, at one point in time they were at the peak early on. For me, I've just got great memories tied up in this album here, listening to it with my older brother and then borrowing it from him, trading him for it, eventually it being one of the first cassettes that I would drive around in when I got my license. So just lots and lots of great memories on here. But all the songs are good, again, from start to finish on this thing, from their cover of the Slade classic, Come On, Feel the Noise, the song that really kind of broke them through, but their own hits that are on here as well. Metal Health, the title of this thing, but I love the song Slick Black Cadillac that actually went back to the first two albums, that era of the band where Randy Rhoads was part of the lineup. We can only imagine what the band would have been like had he stayed with the band and not gone on to join Ozzy. But that song there, Love's a Bitch, is another great one on here. All of these on here just help make this a heavy metal masterpiece, and this remains my favorite Quiet Riot album. Okay, next one up, Metallica, Master of Puppets. 1986 release, third studio album from the band. Last to feature bassist Cliff Burton, unfortunately, who would come to pass through a tragedy shortly after this album's release, dying in a car accident or bus accident, as it would be, their tour bus that had an accident. But at the time, this album would go on to sell 1 million copies on its own, with no radio play, no video play, nothing like that, just word of mouth, this album. And it really shows you the quality that the album can be when it can sell 1 million copies by word of mouth alone. Ultimately, it has gone on to sell 7 million copies in the US alone. So for this one here, I just think, again, it's got great songs, amazing production on this one, far better in my opinion than the first two albums. It got rid of that sort of very raw sound on those, and now we've got more amazing sort of epic sounding tracks like Battery, Master of Puppets, of course currently riding high because of it being included in the TV show Stranger Things. Welcome Home Sanitarium on here. My personal favorite on here is the instrumental Orion, which I think is really great. And just another thing that says what a heavy metal masterpiece this can be, that when even the instrumental track that's on this can be as good as the rest of the things here. So there you go. All right, and the last one that we're going to talk about is Judas Priest, Painkiller from 1990. 12th studio album. This was my first from the band, which is probably more the reason why I'm choosing it here. I know a lot of you guys are probably screaming out right now as to why I didn't pick Screaming for Vengeance or something like that. But interesting thing about the album, if you didn't know, is actually delayed by 5 months due to the trial that was going on at the time over subliminal messages in one of their albums, Stained Glass. But or Stained Class. Band was ultimately found not guilty, and when they returned, it was such a triumphant sounding return with this album here. It was the first one to feature drummer Scott Travis joining the band. He brought that double kick drum to their sound and giving them a much harder edge, but also a little bit more of a modern sound. And they also brought in keyboardist Don Airey to play on the album. All of those sort of things, I think, really helping this album move to the next level. It was the first time since 1978 that they had their producer Chris Sanders with them. In my opinion, this is the best produced of all the Judas Priest albums. I've always been a big fan of Chris's. The album itself would go on to sell 500,000 copies in the US, and Judas Priest has never been a big seller, unlike, say, Metallica or some of these other ones here, but that's still significant sales amongst the metal world. And there are 3 singles that came off this, which are still being played live in concert today, prove just how great these songs were at the time. The title track, Painkiller, Nightcrawler, Touch of Evil, all songs that I absolutely loved when they came out. But again, it was the rest of the album, the deeper cuts that were on here that just pushed this one over the top. Hell Patrol, Leather Rebel, Between the Hammer and the Anvil, all of those songs together making this a heavy metal masterpiece. So there you go. There's at least 5 albums that I consider heavy metal masterpieces. I'm sure you guys have your own opinions on what makes a heavy metal masterpiece and whether I should have chosen different ones from these bands. And it's not to say that these bands don't have multiple heavy metal masterpieces. Certainly Iron Maiden, Metallica, Judas Priest, etc. all do have multiple heavy metal masterpieces that will maybe turn up in future episodes. But there you go. That's this episode here. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts. Have a great one, and I'll be talking to you all real soon. Bye-bye, everyone.